and thank you for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of British in Europe, and also I'd like to personally thank you for your support on citizens' rights. British in Europe is the largest coalition of UK citizens groups across the EU 27. We're defending the rights of over 1.2 million UK nationals living in the EU 27, 80% of whom are working age or younger. More than 60% of us were unable to vote in the UK referendum because British mobile citizens lose their vote after 15 years outside the UK. Together with our friends, the 3 million living in the UK, we make up nearly 1/3 of all EU citizens who fully use their right of free movement. 5 million of only 17 million who fully use their rights of free movement. The situation of these EU citizens who have lived in uncertainty for more than 3 years now is even more uncertain than it was back in March. With 23 days to go until the 31st of October, the UK is in the throes of a constitutional crisis, and there is no clarity whether there will be a deal or not. We have all been badly let down by the UK government, which, for all its protestations to the contrary, never made its own citizens living in the EU 27 a priority. I myself have been an EU citizen in some form or another since the age of 7, for 46 years. At the age of 14, I decided I wanted to work in Europe, and I went on to study for a maîtrise in Paris, and then to live and work in Belgium, Italy, and now Germany. These are the opportunities that EU citizenship and free movement have given me. In 1991, 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I met my husband, a former GDR citizen, while doing the stage at the European Commission. He had only just become an EU citizen at the age of 27. My husband, as a former GDR citizen, knows about hard borders and the value of free movement, and he understands how much this means to me. The irony is that because I married him and moved with him to his hometown of Berlin 10 years ago, I could become a German citizen, and I will keep my EU citizenship while others will not. But that doesn't mean to say that all my rights are secured, and this loss of rights affects not just me, but my whole family, all Europeans, my European family, all EU citizens. And it is the same for my co-chair of British in Europe, who is also married to a German, who arrived in Germany as a Chilean refugee, but who also spent a large part of his life in the UK. This is why the distinctions made in the context of the EU-UK negotiations between EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU are artificial. Our lives are bound up with each other. You can't just roll back the developments of the last 30-odd years and deny the integration that has come with free movement. My husband's key question in all of this is, why would we go backwards? Why would we go backwards? Well, it appears that the root of the problem is that the UK does want to go backwards, or at least part of the population does, as well as the current government. But the EU does not need to go backwards too, especially on citizens' rights. Let us go back to the beginning and look at what was promised to these EU citizens in May 2017. Michel Barnier said in Florence, and I quote, "The level of protection afforded under EU law must not be watered down. Brexit should not alter the nature of people's daily lives." The essential principles on citizens' rights in June 2017 said, "The withdrawal agreement should protect the rights of EU 27 citizens, UK nationals and their family members who at the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement have enjoyed rights relating to free movement under union law, as well as rights which are in the process of being obtained and the rights the enjoyment of which will intervene at a later date." So the starting point was, we will not go backwards and remove rights. Guy Verhofstadt confirmed that last week before the Petty Committee in this Parliament, when he said the starting point of the negotiations was that our rights should continue as before. During the negotiations, however, this was watered down to the concept that citizens should be able to continue their lives broadly as before and with protection limited to existing life choices, I quote. As Guy Verhofstadt also said last week, when talking about UK settled status, broadly as before does not mean the same. We agree with him. Moreover, the 3 million British in Europe also have pointed out many times, including in this place, that life choices are made on the basis of rights, not vice versa, and that it was the rights that should be protected and not some sort of lifestyle choice. So we were already going backwards, and some rights were to be removed for both groups. Now we have unfortunately reached the point where, if there is no deal, those EU rights deriving from EU law, which the EU said it would protect, would evaporate at EU level, and nearly a third of all EU citizens who fully exercise their free movement rights in the EU would simply default to third country nationals overnight, without any protection of their former status at EU level. British citizens in the EU will lose all of their EU citizenship rights, while EU citizens in the UK will lose those rights that they have exercised in the UK. Now, that is going backwards. Note that I say at EU level and EU rights. No deal is a disaster for British in Europe and the 3 million, as there will be 28 unilateral national solutions for the 5 million citizens most directly affected by Brexit. Their status will be dependent on where they live. In other words, not an EU solution at all. Instead, the EU has outsourced the problem of UK citizens' rights to the EU 27, encouraging the EU 27 to be generous with varying degrees of success, while EU 27 citizens will have to rely on a UK national solution. And for both groups, there will be no protection of an international treaty, and important reciprocal issues such as pensions and healthcare, as well as recognition of qualifications, will simply not be covered. Neither will there be clear adherence to the principles of non-discrimination or equal treatment, both covered by the citizens' rights part of the withdrawal agreement. As my colleague Dimitris Skarlatou has very aptly suggested, it really is like being on a sinking ship with lifeboats, ignoring the lifeboats and waiting instead for 28 different rescue boats with different rescue plans to arrive. We recognise, of course, fully that the EU has several dilemmas. First, it has 5 million convinced Europeans who have exercised their EU citizenship rights, activated and owned them. In short, claim them as individual rights. But the law has not moved with the reality of citizens owning their EU citizenship as an individual right, because EU citizenship is still dependent on the relationship between states and state membership of the Union. Of course, we recognise the EU needs to protect the integrity of the internal market and the 4 freedoms in the context of its negotiations with the UK. But what is the point of the European Union protecting that in the abstract if it does not protect the concrete exercise of those fundamental rights of freedom of movement by the citizens who are at the heart of the Union? Then the EU owes a duty of care to all of its citizens, including British citizens in the EU 27. This is particularly pressing for the 3.6 million EU 27 citizens who may soon be living in a third country. At the same time, a new Commission is due to take office under the banner of a union that strives for more and with the pledge to listen to the people of Europe and strengthen our democracy. And of itself, the idea of a European way of life that is about shared values and principles, including the rule of law and fundamental rights, is positive, as well as the idea that aspirations for Europe evolve from generation to generation. We would then thus ask President-elect van der Leyen to listen to 5 million of the people of Europe and their families when we say that we are about to go backwards. The EU is missing an unprecedented opportunity to show that Europe goes beyond the national. It is missing an unprecedented opportunity to show that fundamental rights of EU citizens matter. And it is missing the opportunity to recognise that not only the aspirations that we have for Europe, but also our aspirations about EU citizenship have evolved. So what can be done? Mr Verhofstadt said last week that the best way to deal with this problem is ring fencing that is not ring fencing, unilateral engagements from both sides rather than a deal, where the UK states that even in the case of no deal, it will guarantee the rights set out in the withdrawal agreement and implement them more favourably than it has offered to date, and that the 27 will pledge unilaterally to do exactly the same. If that really is the most to which the EU can aspire, then certainly the unilateral offers need improvement. But let's be clear that this isn't really ring fencing or protecting the EU rights we have acquired and exercised at all. It still doesn't solve the fundamental issue that in a no-deal situation, the solution being proposed is that our EU rights evaporate effectively, and the problem is outsourced to 28 different countries with no protection at EU level. Mr Verhofstadt recognised that himself when he said, with respect to settled status, that in a no-deal situation there would be no legal protection based on an international agreement. And the UK could unilaterally change the system, even if EU citizens have acquired settled status. The same would, of course, be true for the EU 27 and the status of British citizens in their countries. But we have been told, of course, that ring fencing is impossible and that this reciprocal unilateral engagement approach is the only way to avoid an inflation of mini-deals, which is simply a way for the UK to pick and choose its advantages in its future relationship with the EU. First citizens, and then it will be other areas such as transport, fish, etc. But this ignores three important facts. First, this is not about an advantage for the UK because both sides have a mutual interest in securing the rights of their citizens. Second, with respect, transport and fish were not the stated first priority in the negotiations. Third, if the UK seeks further mini-deals, all the EU has to do is to say no. We do not yet know what will happen by the 31st of October, but this situation of uncertainty for citizens cannot continue. Again, anxiety levels are rising as we face a cliff edge. If an Article 50 extension is agreed, citizens need the EU to commit to EU-level ring fencing as soon as the extension commences, and that must be an EU-wide solution. This is because ring fencing at the last moment is impossible, as it would require UK-EU agreement on it, ratification by the British and European Parliaments, and legislation implementing it to be passed in the UK Parliament before it can ratify. And all of this has to take place before exit day. And it cannot be done after Brexit and thus outside the scope of Article 50, because ratification through 27 national parliaments would then be required. So British in Europe and the 3 million, my colleagues, are not asking for anything to be renegotiated, but we are asking for what was already agreed for both sets of citizens to be saved rather than shredded. These children of the European project look to you to recognise the duty of care that the EU owes to them. They call on you to recognise how urgently you need to protect 5 million of your most committed citizens, including young British adults who have grown up in other countries and are truly becoming citizens of nowhere in some cases, where they cannot easily apply for citizenship in their host country. Above all, please don't let down 5 million of the only 17 million EU citizens who have used their free movement rights and penalise them for being committed Europeans. If you do, you will not only undermine their belief in the European project, but that of future generations as well. Thank you.